Rosamond Wyndham stood in the corridor outside her husband's study on a Tuesday morning in March, still wearing her winter coat, and heard Cedric tell Morton Pryor exactly how long it would take to remove her from the management of the Fairfield mill. She had come in from the cold, from a walk along the canal she took most mornings, the same canal her father had walked, watching the water run dark under the ice in the last weeks of winter, and she had heard voices before she reached the sitting room. Low voices, deliberate, the particular register of men discussing something they believed would not be overheard. She stopped. She was not a woman given to standing in corridors and listening. Her father, Godfrey Fairfield, had raised her to walk directly into rooms and speak plainly. He had been a blunt man, a mill owner, who had started with one loom and a contract no one else wanted, and who had built his business on the principle that honesty was more efficient than maneuvering. She had inherited his instinct for directness. But something in the weight of the silence between words held her exactly where she stood. "The petition can be filed by Thursday," Morton Pryor was saying. His voice had the careful quality of a man reading from notes, or who had rehearsed. "I've documented 6 instances of mismanagement in the past 14 months. 3 are verifiable from the accounts you gave me. The other 3 I can substantiate from her own correspondence." Her correspondence. "How long once it's filed?" Cedric asked. 4 to 6 weeks for the hearing. Given the documentation and the statements we've arranged, the court will appoint a guardian of the estate within 60 days. At that point, control of the Fairfield interests transfers to me, as her husband. As the appointed administrator, yes. Rosamond pressed her back against the wall and did not move. She thought about the word documentation. She thought about guardian of the estate, which was the legal architecture for removing a woman from property she owned outright, on the grounds that she was unfit, mentally or morally, to oversee it. She thought about the word petition. She thought about Thursday. 4 days. Her father's voice came to her clearly, the way it always came in moments that required her to think and not feel. He had said it when she was 12, sitting her down on the stool beside his desk in the mill office, the smell of wool and machine oil all around them. "First you understand what happened, then you decide what to do, never the other way around." She understood what had happened. She straightened her spine and walked back toward the front of the house. The Fairfield mill had been Godfrey Fairfield's life's work, and then for the last 18 months it had been Rosamond's. She had learned the business the way most girls in Providence learned needlework. Sitting beside someone who knew it, watching every detail, asking questions until the questions ran out and understanding began. By 17 she could read the production ledgers faster than the clerk who kept them. By 20 she had renegotiated 2 supplier contracts in her father's name while he recovered from pneumonia, and she had gotten better terms than he'd had before. Her marriage to Cedric Wyndham had been arranged. Such things were arranged in 1883 among families of property. His family had connections she lacked. Banking connections, social capital, the kind of name that opened rooms her father's name did not quite reach. Her father had believed, with the optimism of men who build things from nothing, that a good marriage would protect what he had built. He had not been wrong about the shape of the problem. He had been wrong about the solution. She had known within 6 months of the wedding that Cedric was not interested in her. Not in her opinion, not in her knowledge, not in the long careful way she had of thinking through a problem before she spoke. He was interested in what she represented, the mill, the property, the Fairfield name, that moved bolts of fabric through 3 states. And he had the patience of a man who understood that what he wanted would come to him if he simply waited. She had not loved him. She had not expected to. She had been dutiful and competent and careful, and she had run the Fairfield mill for 18 months after her father's death, without making a single decision she could not defend in writing. That she now understood had not been enough. Vernon Gale had worked at the Fairfield mill for 22 years. He had started as a floor hand at 17, become a loom operator, then floor supervisor, then foreman. He had known Rosamond since she was 8 years old, and had once chased her out of the carding room. Before she could get her fingers caught in machinery, she had no business touching. He was 61 now, with the broad hands of a man who had spent 4 decades in physical work, and the careful eyes of someone who had watched a great deal happen without always being able to stop it. She found him in the equipment room at the east end of the mill, checking the tension on a mechanical drive that had been running rough since January. She told him what she had heard. She told it quickly, no decoration, no softening, Just the facts in the order they had occurred. Vernon set down his wrench. He was quiet for a moment. She recognized as the quiet of a man who has heard something he already half suspected. "Mrs. Wyndham," he said, "there's something I should have brought to you 3 weeks ago." He took her to the record room, the secondary one, storing older correspondence from before her father's time. He pulled a box from the second shelf and set it on the work table. Inside was a folder that didn't belong. Newer paper, different ink, 13 pages of what appeared to be production records, each one annotated in a hand she recognized as Morton Pryor's, each one documenting a decision she had made and characterizing it as a financial error. 3 of the entries were outright fabrications. Decisions she had never made, purchases she had never authorized. One referenced a contract she had specifically declined in November because the terms were unfavorable. She had declined it in writing. She had the letter upstairs. "How long has this been here?" she asked. 6 days, Vernon said. He had not known what to do with it. He said this without excusing himself, the way a man speaks when he knows he has waited too long and is not going to pretend otherwise. She was not angry at him. She could not afford the unfocused kind of anger right now. "Pull every legitimate production record from the past 14 months, she said. "Every contract, every ledger, every signed piece of correspondence, in my office by this afternoon." He nodded, his jaw set in the way of a man who has decided exactly where his loyalty is. She went upstairs. She found the letter about Elspeth by accident. Going through the correspondence files, looking for the November contract letter, she found a note she did not remember writing. It was a copy, in her own handwriting, but the date was wrong. October 14th. She had been in Hartford on October 14th, attending a funeral for a cousin of her father's. She had not been in the office. She had not written a letter on October 14th. She read it, 2 paragraphs describing a September decision about a dye supplier, but characterizing it as impulsive, as made without consulting the accounts, as characteristic of her management style, first person, her phrasing, her sentence structure. Someone had studied how she wrote long enough to imitate it. She sat with that. Then she thought about who had spent enough time in her company to know her voice on the page. Who had read her letters? Who had sat with her at the writing desk on evenings she drafted correspondence, keeping her company with embroidery and conversation? Elspeth Darrow had been her closest friend since they were girls in school together. Light-haired, quick-witted, with a gift for observation that Rosamund had always admired. For the past 2 years she had spent more time in the Wyndham house than anyone except the household staff. Access to Rosamund's office, her correspondence, her private worries about the mill's direction, every conversation about every decision Rosamund had second-guessed aloud. She thought about those conversations differently now. She thought about how often Cedric had known things she hadn't told him, how a concern she had expressed to Elspeth on a Wednesday would surface somehow in Cedric's remarks by the following weekend. She had told herself it was coincidence. She had told herself that Elspeth would not. She took out a clean sheet of paper and wrote, "I need to see you this afternoon. Not at the house, come to the mill." She sent it with the hallboy and went back to the records. At noon, Vernon brought her a second piece of information. He said it carefully, with the precision of a man who knows the weight of words. He had been talking with the mill's wool broker, Denning, who had worked the Providence trade for 30 years, and knew everyone who had ever been involved in textile manufacturing in New England. Denning had mentioned, in passing, that Morton Pryor had done accounting work in Hartford before coming to Providence. That in Hartford he had worked for a widow named Annis Bracewell, who owned a small print works. That the print works had passed to her late husband's family 18 months after Pryor's arrival. Following a court petition declaring her unable to manage the business due to erratic decision-making. Rosamund was quiet for a moment. "Is Mrs. Bracewell still in Hartford?" she asked. Vernon believed so. "Find me her address by end of day." He found it by 3 o'clock. She wrote to Annis Bracewell that afternoon, direct and specific, explaining what she knew, what was being prepared against her, and asking whether Mrs. Bracewell's situation had followed the same pattern. She sent it by the evening post with a request for a reply as quickly as possible. Then she went to meet Elspeth. Elspeth Darrow came into the mill's sample room at 3:30 with the expression of a woman who has received an unusual summons and is not certain what it means. She looked at Rosamund across the work table with something in her face that was not quite guilt and not quite innocence. It was the look of someone who had made a choice. and was beginning to understand its full dimensions. Rosamund placed the forged letter on the table between them. October 14th, she said. I was in Hartford. Elspeth looked at the letter. She did not reach for it. She did not speak immediately. How long? Rosamund asked. Not when it had started. She already understood roughly when it had started. She asked how long Elspeth had understood what she was doing. 8 months, Elspeth said it quietly. Cedric had come to her in the summer, she said. He had framed it as concern. Genuine worry about Rosamund's ability to manage the mill alone. Too much responsibility, too much strain. He was persuasive. He had a gift for persuasion that Rosamund had observed before without fully measuring. He told me we were protecting you, Elspeth said. And you believed that, Rosamund said. At first. Then I found one of the documents Morton had prepared. The one about the November contract. I knew that wasn't true. I knew you'd declined that contract deliberately. She stopped. That is not accurate. She started again. I told myself it wasn't my business to question it. I told myself I had already participated too much to step back. You had written documents in my voice, Rosamund said, and you made a choice to keep going. Elspeth said yes without defense. Rosamund stood up. She took the forged letter and put it in the folder with the others. I'm going to ask you one question, she said, and I need you to answer honestly, because I believe you still know what honesty costs, even if you've lost track of what it's worth. Elspeth waited. Did he ever tell you what would happen to me after the petition? What my life was supposed to look like once he controlled the mill? A pause long enough that the answer was present before the words were. He said you'd be provided for, Elspeth said. That you wouldn't lack for anything, that it would be better for you, less strain. Rosamund held her gaze. He told you the same things he told himself, she said. So he wouldn't have to think about what he was actually doing. She picked up the folder. I am going to be angry at you, she said. I want you to know that. Not now. I don't have time for it now, and the anger I have this afternoon is pointed at the people who designed this, and you were, in the end, a tool they used. But I am going to be angry. That is a conversation we will have when this is finished. She paused at the door. When Judge Carew's office contacts you, and they will tell them everything. Every conversation, every document you saw, every instruction Cedric or Morton gave you. Don't protect either of them. Elspeth said she would. Rosamund walked out. The shareholders' meeting of the Fairfield Mill was a quarterly event held in the second-floor boardroom, windows overlooking the production floor. Rosamund had chaired every one of those meetings since her father's death. Prepared, precise, familiar with every figure on every page. The meeting the following Friday was the one Cedric had chosen. She knew this because she had found the correspondence between him and Morton Pryor. Not in the study, but in the leather portfolio Cedric left on the boardroom table, after working with Morton on Thursday afternoon. Vernon had brought it to her that morning with the quiet certainty of a man who was done making the error of withholding things. The letters in the portfolio described the plan precisely. The falsified documents would be introduced at Friday's meeting as internal records. Morton would present them. Cedric would call for a vote of no confidence in the current management, and he would follow it immediately with the court petition, already drafted. The petition was in the portfolio as well. She read it from beginning to end, standing in Vernon's office. She sent for Judge Carew. Alistair Carew had been her father's solicitor for 20 years and had known Rosamund since she was too small to reach the handle of the law firm's front door. He was a careful, dry-mannered man who spoke precisely and moved slowly and had the quality of making people feel slightly foolish for having tried to rush him. He arrived at 4 o'clock Thursday, read through everything Rosamund had assembled, and said nothing for a full 3 minutes. Then he said, "The petition is fraudulent. Every piece of supporting documentation is either fabricated or misrepresented." He set the last page down. "The production records, when compared against the legitimate ledgers, are not merely inaccurate. They are the records of a mill that does not exist, managed by a woman who does not exist." He paused. "And you have tomorrow's meeting," he said. "Yes." He closed his notebook. "Be there, with everything. Let them begin. Then give them a chance to hear what they've actually done, before you show them what you know." The shareholders of the Fairfield Mill, 7 men, all business associates of her father's, men who had watched her grow up in that building, and who had adjusted their assessment of her, over 18 months from polite uncertainty to something approaching genuine respect, were seated and waiting at 9 o'clock Friday morning. Cedric sat at the far end of the table, Morton Pryor beside him with a leather briefcase. Rosamund took her chair at the head of the table and called the meeting to order. She presented the quarterly production figures. She went through them with the same unhurried precision she always brought: yield per loom, labor hours, material costs, net margin. The numbers were strong. They were stronger than her father's last full year, a fact she noted without emphasis, because it was simply true. Cedric waded through the entire report. When she finished, he said, "There are some concerns I'd like to raise about the mill's recent management." "Of course," she said. He nodded to Morton, who opened the briefcase. Rosamund reached beneath her chair and set the leather portfolio on the table. The room shifted. The particular quality of attention in it changed in the way attention changes when people simultaneously understand that something unexpected is happening. "Before the documents in Mr. Pryor's briefcase are presented," she said, "I'd like the board to review something first." She slid the portfolio to the shareholder nearest her, a man named Alderman, who had known her father for 30 years. He opened it. He read the first letter. His face did something careful and deliberate. He passed it to the man beside him. By the time the portfolio reached the third shareholder, Morton Pryor had closed his briefcase. Rosamund placed the forged letter on the table. She placed the falsified production records beside it. She placed her own legitimate records beside those. 14 months of actual figures, signed and dated, checkable against every contract and invoice in the mill's files. "A petition of incompetence was filed against me this morning at the county court," she said. "The petition is supported by documentation fabricated by Mr. Pryor and introduced into this mill's records without my knowledge. The production figures you are looking at now represent what this mill has actually done under my management." She looked at Cedric. He was entirely composed. She would give him that. "My husband was aware of this plan," she said. "The correspondence in front of you describes it in his words, in his hand." The silence in the room had the quality of men recalibrating. Not dramatically, not with shouting, but with the focused quiet of people who have spent their lives making decisions based on information, and are now reviewing what information they actually have. Judge Carew, seated against the wall where she had asked him to be, spoke for the first time. "The petition filed this morning has been stayed pending a fraud investigation initiated this hour." He spoke with the measured weight of 40 years of formal proceedings. "Any vote taken on the basis of the documents in Mr. Pryor's briefcase would be a vote taken on fabricated evidence. I am recommending the board defer any motion regarding management until the court's review is complete." He paused. "What I am not recommending," he said, "is that you ignore what you've just read." No one moved for a long moment. Then Alderman, who had sat across from Godfrey Fairfield at 100 meetings before this one, said quietly, "The figures are good, Mrs. Wyndham." He was looking at the real ledgers. "Yes," she said, "they are." Morton Pryor stood without being asked and walked out of the boardroom. His footsteps were very clear on the floor. Cedric did not stand. He sat at the far end of the table and looked at Rosamund for a moment, long enough that she understood he was still calculating, still looking for the angle he hadn't yet found. Then he put his hands flat on the table and left without speaking. She watched him go. She thought about the version of a life she had believed, briefly and carefully, she was building with him. Not a loving life. She had known it would not be that, but a civil one, a workable one. She thought about how long he had been planning this while she was planning the mill's spring contracts. She felt it fully for one moment, the weight of 4 years of careful accommodation, of choosing not to see what she had not wanted to see. Then she turned back to the room. "Gentlemen," she said, "I believe we were reviewing the second quarter projections." Annis Bracewell arrived in Providence on a Tuesday, 12 days after Rosamund had written to her. She came on her own, without warning, with a carpet bag and an envelope of court documents from Hartford. She was perhaps 40, compact and precise, with the careful posture of a woman who had learned to take up exactly the space she needed and not 1 inch more. She sat across from Rosamund, in the mill office, and placed the envelope on the desk between them without preamble. "I lost the print works," she said, simply, as a fact. "Pryor spent 8 months constructing evidence that I was incapable of managing it. I had no one who knew the business well enough to contradict him. The court believed his documentation. I've spent 4 years thinking about every conversation I had with him. Every moment he could have taken something I said and turned it against me." She looked at the desk. When your letter came, she said, I recognized every single thing you described. Will you give a sworn statement to Judge Carew? Rosamond asked. I wrote one on the coach. Annis reached into the carpet bag and produced 12 pages in a clear, deliberate hand. I've had 4 years to remember everything. The fraud case against Morton Pryor was heard 6 weeks later. Cedric's cooperation agreement, negotiated by his own attorney, who understood clearly that his client's position was not a strong one, included a full surrender of the fabricated records, a sworn account of his arrangement with Pryor, and a signed statement withdrawing any claim to the management or ownership of the Fairfield mill. Pryor was convicted on 3 counts of fraud and 1 of conspiracy to deceive the court. Annis stayed in Providence for 3 months. She slept in the East guest room, reorganized the mill's supplier filing system, and had long conversations with Vernon Gale about production methods she had developed at the print works before she lost it, some of which Rosamond incorporated into the spring schedule. They wrote to each other after that, for years, short letters, specific and warm, the correspondence of 2 busy women who had decided the connection between them was worth the time. Rosamond spoke with Elspeth twice before the end of summer. The first conversation was the angry one. She had promised it, and she kept it, because she kept her promises, and because Elspeth deserved the full weight of what the betrayal had cost, not softened, not diluted. Elspeth sat through it without offering defense. When Rosamond finished, Elspeth said only, You were right, about all of it. I don't have anything to add to that. The second conversation was different. They sat in the kitchen garden of the Fairfield house, a small garden, neglected, that Rosamond's mother had planted 20 years before, and that she had lately begun to reclaim, 1 bed at a time. The late August light was long and golden, and they sat without speaking for several minutes before Elspeth said, I don't know how to be your friend after this. I don't know if that's something that's still possible. Rosamond thought about it. She thought honestly, the way her father had taught her, from the outside in, without the interference of wanting a particular answer. I don't know either, she said, not the way it was. That version is over. She looked at the garden. But I think there might be something on the other side of it if you want to look for it. I'm not ready to say what it would look like. She paused. What I can say is that I know who you are when you are not afraid, Elspeth. And I would rather try to find a way back to that than lose it entirely. Elspeth was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was unsteady. That's more than I deserve. Probably, Rosamond said. But you are still my oldest friend. And I'm not willing to let a man who is already gone take that from me as well. By autumn, the Fairfield mill was running the best numbers it had seen in a decade. The spring contracts had held. The supplier agreements renegotiated over the summer were better than the previous ones by a margin that Rosamond noted in the ledger without commentary, because the numbers spoke for themselves. Vernon Gale stood in the doorway of the mill office one morning in October and said, Your father would have something to say about these figures. She looked up from the accounts. He would have said they could be better, she said. Vernon allowed himself something close to a smile. He would have been wrong. He went back to the floor. Rosamond sat alone in the office for a moment, the smell of wool and machine oil around her. The same smell it had always been, the same smell as her father's hands at the end of a working day. She looked at the ledger open in front of her, 18 months of figures, that told the story of everything she had built and kept and defended. Her father had been right about the numbers. They were honest when people weren't. They told you everything, if you knew how to read them. She had read them. She turned to a fresh page and kept working.